Nualláin from Ireland, please, with the lecture,
Um,
Free Energy.
Yes, Seán is not able to give the talk, but I will give on behalf of him. I am David Bernal-Casas, second author of the paper.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Okay. Let me share my desktop.
Yes.
I'm zooming. Okay. So thank you for the invitation. So unfortunately, Seán is not around. He's traveling at the moment, but I'm gonna be talking about the work that he has been leading over the last months. So essentially, we call it Friston, Free Energy, and the late Walter Freeman, the third, because essentially what we are doing is that we are backing up all the work that was done by Freeman, taking into account the free energy principle published by Friston, and framing intentionality in terms of scientific observables. So first of all, I'm going to introduce you into the topic, which is first slide. It's a bit dense, I know, but essentially here we are reviewing all the Freeman's work. So Freeman worked for almost 50 years, and in the first period of his research, he used the language of linear systems. So he published a very famous book in 1975. And then at that point, he realized that he could not explain brain dynamics using linear principles. So he moved into nonlinear dynamical systems. So as I am saying here in my slide, so he replaced linear models with attractors and neural dynamics with trajectories in a state space that now are being used by everybody in the neuroscientific community. So this approach culminated in many beautiful papers about scale-free dynamics. So these are papers that are one of the most cited papers. And then I move to the next slide. So things were at the classical level for a while until he met Giuseppe Vitiello. And while he was skeptical at the beginning about using quantum field theory, he became open to the idea that symmetry breaking could, in fact, began what were in effect the basis of attractors in the neural trajectories. So he moved from linear dynamics into nonlinear dynamics and quantum principles to explain neural trajectories. So obviously the next century will reveal whether he was right or wrong about using quantum field theory. Okay, at this point you may answer why we are presenting here. As essentially Freeman, and we follow him, both Seán and myself, Freeman saw the brain as a thermodynamic system. In fact, this is a sentence that he wrote in one of his books: brains are far from equilibrium thermodynamic systems that control cognition and action. And for him, perception was the process of exploiting free energy to turn information into knowledge. Okay, I move forward, then I am highlighting some of the sentences in order to introduce you into this presentation. So he thought that the sensory motor arc, which is also called the sensory motor cycle or the action perception cycle, forms the basis for behavior and essentially involves the brain changing a state from a sparse gas into a dense liquid. And obviously, as we all know from thermodynamics, that is essentially the definition of a phase transition. So for him, the way of perceiving, or the way that the brain works in perceiving things, is by using or by generating phase transitions. In perceptual terms, it involves changing from a receptive state, which is accepting inputs, into an active state in which internal connections, rather than stimuli from outside, recruit neurons. I move forward and then I introduce you Karl Friston free energy principle, because this is the principle that was published in 2010. He titled the article as a unified brain theory, And essentially what Friston is doing is he is focusing on the informational dimension of energy. So for Friston, efficient coding has thermodynamic consequences. So I don't know, but you may be, or you may have read things about minimization of free energy, so as a brain theory. So we are going to take this concept and then we are going to tweak a little bit in order to explain intentionality. But essentially here our concerns are slightly different than Friston concept of free energy. Essentially, we follow Freeman, and what we argue here is that the brain works far for thermodynamic equilibrium, and in fact the brain uses external objects to stabilize itself. And this is part of what has been known classically as intentionality, that was coined first by Tomás d'Aquinas. I move to the next slide. So how we are going to expand on how we are thinking, are expanding Friston free energy principle. So it is in his adaptation of Friston's free energy that we wish to expand our theory, and essentially is to accept that free energy is used to convert, or in the conversion of information to knowledge. So this is the treatment of the relationship between mind and world, the more sophisticated as Friston poses at the moment, and uses the Carnot cycle as its model. Remember from thermodynamics, the Carnot cycle to explain the work that we can get from mechanical systems. So he found and established an isomorphism between the Carnot cycle and how does the brain work. So back to intentionality. So Freeman was already aware of the historical precedents, and for him, stimuli enter the sense organs and cause a trajectory of successive states to be reached until this cascade ends at termini like the olfactory valve. So Freeman was using olfactory perception as the paradigms to study this action perception cycle. So as I said, and I already introduced, in the sensation perception motor cycle, he established an isomorphism between the trajectories that he saw in neuronal experiments and the Carnot cycle to explain the sensation perception motor cycle that I will cover in a minute. So specifically what he did is, and what we have been doing, is that we can replace the volume of the x-axis with the rate of change of entropy and the pressure on the y-axis by the rate of change of free energy. And we are going to tell you how these two entities can be indexed by using neuronal recordings. So essentially, what are the scientific observables? So while we all know that intentionality was a classical concept, we here say that we can provide an observable, essentially, right? And the observable is it is consisting, and it is called, and it was called as well by Freeman, pragmatic information. The pragmatic information is essentially the ratio between the rate of change of free energy, as Friston has pointed out, but divided by the rate of change of entropy. And we believe that this ratio, this measurement, is in fact the neural correlate of intentionality. So let me explain a little bit more how we can index free energy. So in EEG systems, electroencephalogram systems, we can index free energy as the square of the amplitude of the EEG signal. And likewise, we can calculate the entropy defined as the difference, for example, using Euclidean distances between each successive signals or between two consecutive frames. So the index, as I said, is the ratio between the rate of change of free energy divided by the rate of change of entropy. So this is, sorry, I go back. This is for us a measure of intentionality. And this, and we believe, and that this casts light for the first time on an ancient epistemological problem using only scientific observables. I move forward. So in here, essentially what we argue is that a max value of an index called pragmatic information, which is a vertex that you are going to see now in the Carnot cycle, defined as the maximum rate in free energy divided by the minimum change in entropy, is the epitome of intentionality. And this is essentially the point of optimal classification between or for conditional stimuli. So essentially what he did, and we have extended, is that we have taken the Carnot cycle. In here we are showing the Rankine vapor cycle, in which, as you all know, it is consisting of 4 isoclines. And what we have at the first stage, which is denoted by number 1, is that we are getting, or our brain are getting inputs, right? And the inputs, essentially, they recruit Hebbian neuronal assemblies. And what the brain essentially does at that moment, it goes from 1 to 2, it decreases the entropy. In other words, it increases the order, and also it increases the rate of free energy. So we go from 1 to 2 by decreasing entropy or increasing order, and then we go from 2 to 3 by increasing the energy. So at the point 3, which is the optimal stage, and Seán called it authentic state, is the optimal point to discriminate conditional stimuli. And we believe that this is the point where you have maximum free energy, minimum entropy or higher order, and the system gets into the optimal. This optimal, it's been calculated using the observables that I mentioned before, and what Freeman and some others have seen in labs is that it generates a AM pattern, an amplitude modulation pattern. Then after, at the stage number 3, it spreads over the brain to generate order in some other brain areas. So from 3 to 4, essentially what we go is we have like an increase of entropy. So the order, it is being somehow, the order generated at stage number 3, it's now being conveyed to some other brain regions. And then at stage number 4, we went back to the previous, and then we receive new inputs. So I move forward. So essentially, this topic that was first, Freeman saw it for the first time, it's called cortical dynamics, and we thought that that could be the starting point in order to generate better theories for explaining brain dynamics. So as I am concluding here, cortical dynamics was already seen by Freeman as the way forward for the 21st century, and he was very aware of philosophical tradition and related a new index called pragmatic information to intentionality. So with that, I am finishing my presentation. So please, if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer.
Thank you very much, David. Yes.
Yes.
We have several minutes for questions. Anybody wants? Any questions? Anybody wants to ask David?
Yes, please.
Yeah. I don't see. Okay. No questions. Once again, thank you very much, David, for your interesting and brilliant presentation. Yes, yes, David, please, yes, our best regards to Seán and Nualláin, yes, for colleague from Ireland. And now we move